The degree to which the United States was involved in the operation that the Israelis have conducted from the beginning, I think that question is still up in the air. Iran's enriched uranium still arguably largely remains intact, either both with Iranian control or possibly with Russian control. And the only reason I say this is because the Russians have sort of made it clear that their staff is not evacuating, especially from the Bushehr plant near the Persian Gulf.
How is Iran going to respond now?
And by now, images and videos from Tel Aviv are also all over the world, and everybody has seen them. For the Iranians, that is also unprecedented because that is something that they have not done before in history. Neither have they been bombed in history to this degree, and nor have they been able to bomb Israel so sustainably under Israeli fire. The US goal of regime change has not been constant. In fact, in the past, that the US has said that they're not interested in this.
Hello and welcome to the Indian Express. I'm Charulata Biswas and you're watching Explained on Indian Express's official YouTube channel. Today we will be talking about the dramatic shift that has or could reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. And of course, I'm talking about what's happening in Israel and Iran and the conflict and how US President Donald Trump has now intervened in this conflict. He has waded directly into this escalating conflict between the two countries. And after initially distancing himself from Tel Aviv's aggressive strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, three of them, Trump's sudden intervention is being seen as both a bold gamble and a potential strategic misstep. Now, in order for us, you and me, to understand what is really happening, I have with me Bashir Ali, who is Senior Research Associate at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research. Bashir, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you on the Indian Express. My first question to you will be, how do you see Trump's intervention in this conflict right now? Because he did give like a 2-week deadline on Thursday, last Thursday. And then suddenly on Sunday morning, we see Trump announcing these attacks. Can you tell us about your first reaction to this?
Right. Thanks, Charulata. It's a pleasure for me to be here as well and talk to you about this, especially as we all try to really figure out what's happening, because as you also sort of indicated, it still seems a little abrupt, but in some senses, I think everybody was anticipating it. The question was when, right? I think if you remember the moment on June 13th when Israel began its own wave of strikes on Iranian soil, on Iran's military leadership, taking out most of the IRGC's top brass, its energy infrastructure, and most importantly, its nuclear enrichment facilities, right? The first statement to come out of Washington, if you look at both the Secretary of State as well as the Vice President's statements, they sort of went out of their way to explicitly state that this was a unilateral action by Israel and that the United States was not involved. I don't think that there was a direct breach in the positions being expressed by other US officials and the US president until he was asked a pointed question by a reporter, where the reporter asked him that, did you know that Israel was going to conduct these strikes, right? It is at that moment, and we all know how President Trump is used to a very impromptu style of speaking, which, to put it mildly, is unorthodox. But he sort of implies that he didn't just know it, but in fact, he's the one who greenlit it. And from that point onwards, we see more categorical shifts from other US officials that they try to sort of reorient and readjust their own positions. So, in terms of the degree to which the United States was involved in the operation that the Israelis have conducted from the beginning, I think that question is still up in the air. And I suspect that we won't get a conclusive answer to that question anytime soon. About the US strikes themselves, the 10 days, the beginning of the noise that was coming out of Washington about the United States potentially entering the war, there seemed to be this surge in expert opinion that no amount of military action, certainly not one without any ground involvement, can fully take out Iran's road to a nuclear weapon. And this is the broader overview. But in a more tactical sense, in a worm's eye sense, if you look only at the facility at Fordo specifically, where a lot of analysis has focused, it is now largely clear that a single bombing run alone cannot take out the facility. That's one. And second is that it doesn't guarantee that Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium is completely wiped out. And I'm inclined to also believe that because after the US strikes, the IAEA relatively rapidly came out and said that there is no radiation risk or spillover whatsoever, right? And you've had unconfirmed reports of the Iranians sort of attempting to remove at least part of that stockpile before the US strikes. Because it's also clear that there was some degree of telegraphing involved, just like how the Iranians have done in the past. Now, that is one. The second is that what is the outcome of the US strikes today? It draws from what I just said, that Iran's enriched uranium still arguably largely remains intact, either both with Iranian control or possibly with Russian control. And the only reason I say this is because the Russians have sort of made it clear that their staff is not evacuating, especially from the Bushehr plant near the Persian Gulf. But Iran's ability to enrich uranium further it has categorically been hit, but it has not been eliminated. The problem in analysis so far, when we look at these things, is that a lot of the statements that are coming out from both Europe and the United States, but especially from the United States, is that they are talking in superlatives, that the Iranian program has been completely destroyed. President Trump's speech said it has been obliterated, right? But right after that, today morning, there was a Wall Street Journal report that said that the vice president believes that the Iranians retain control of enough enriched uranium to make about 9 to 10 nuclear warheads. If you compare this with all of the statements that US officials have made, both publicly as well as in the Senate intelligence hearings, you would see that they have largely given the same figures in the past. This might be too simplistic, but solely using those figures as a yardstick and putting everything else aside, it would appear that nothing has changed. But what has changed is that for Iran, a sort of nightmare scenario has come about where it sees both US and Israeli warplanes above its skies, flying uncontested, carrying out large scale bombardment of its sort of prized possessions as well as its urban centers, right? So, at an intellectual level, that deterrence has been punctured. But there is a lot of substantial there's a large substantial set of interests for Iran as well to consider when it sort of plans its next step in retaliation to the US strikes. But I can get to that later. But
Yeah, but
insofar as the US action, I think that's where we stand.
of course, there has been contradictory statements from US and Iran about the nuclear facilities being hit. US is saying that they have struck and completely obliterated the nuclear facility. And you talked about Fordo, which has 400 kgs of uranium, as per reports. And they also say that it is about 80 meters deep. So to completely obliterate a nuclear facility using B-2 bombers. I think that kind of looks a little uh, like a dream from Trump's side. But
Yeah,
what I wanted to ask you was, how is Iran going to respond now? Because yesterday we saw some missiles flying over Jerusalem, but
yeah.
that's not enough. Do you think Iran is restraining itself at this point in time and being a little bit more careful about how it's going to respond?
That's the main question today, right?
Yeah.
Because what has happened so far? So far, the moment that the Israelis began their strikes, already it is clear that despite over 10 days now, 10 days of Israeli bombardment, one thing that Iran continues to show is its ability to also hit Israel with its own ballistic missiles. It's also clear now that when Iran began its retaliation against Israel, it spent a lot of its older missiles first before moving on to its more advanced missiles, right? I think one thing at this point, it's useful to use this as a lens when figuring the kind of retaliation that Iran tells to its own people and the world is enough. Because if Iran is able to convince both people at home as well as abroad that it has the ability to do certain things, then its own threat is proved to be credible, right? So, how do the Iranians measure this? It's very evident that the imbalance in military power between Iran and Israel, which has the might of the Western coalition, so to speak, behind it, is almost incomparable, right? So, for the Iranians, the ability to strike Israel itself is a success. Just to illustrate this, I mean, an Iranian ballistic missile from the boost to terminal phase, once it leaves Iranian airspace, it's crossing US naval based air defense assets in the Persian Gulf. It's crossing US land-based assets in Iraq, in Qatar, and elsewhere. It's then again crossing US naval-based air defense assets in the Red Sea, because now we have multiple carrier strike groups that are active in the region. It's then crossing possible Jordanian air defense, which has been active in the past, this time not so clearly. And finally, it then gets to Israel's three-layered air defense system. After that, if the missile even manages to breach Israel's three layers of protection, for the Iranians, that itself is victory. But the
Yeah.
fact that you have at least a few solid fueled missiles that the Iranians are using that's able to hit urban centers in Tel Aviv, and by now, images and videos from Tel Aviv are also all over the world, and everybody has seen them. For the Iranians, that is also unprecedented because that is something that they have not done before in history. Neither have they been bombed in history to this degree, and nor have they been able to bomb Israel so sustainably under Israeli fire. So that is crucial to remember. A few hours right after the US strikes, the IRGC, in its statement, merely said that they know where the US aircraft took off from. Now, that is for anyone to figure out what exactly they meant. But their main commitment to action remained against Israel. Because by the IRGC, I mean the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of
Yeah.
Iran, for which I'm sure by now your viewers are aware, because these are words that have been in our headlines for the last few months now. So if the IRGC is continuing to attack Israel, then the Iranian position remains consistent that no matter what you do, we will be still able to hit Israel, right? The US involvement, however, complicates things because in the last 10 days of Israeli bombardment, the Iranians have been consistent about two things. One is that if the Israelis stop attacking, we'll return to the negotiating table. That hasn't happened. Second is if the United States, instead of halting Israeli attacks or sort of discouraging them from continuing, if the United States joins Israel's war and bombs Iranian nuclear facilities, then Iran will threaten US assets in the region, especially those in the Gulf Arab states, right? It is this threat to
Talking
sort
about
of,
the air
yes.
bases.
Yeah, air bases. But if you look at the way that IRGC officials and other Iranian political officials have spoken, it appears that they indicated that everything is on board, including energy facilities in these Arab states, right? To sort of burn the house down, so to speak, that it's an act of desperation. But it's also crucial to note that Iran made sure to say that if the Arab states helped the US effort, because in April 2024, when you had the first unprecedented exchange of strikes directly between Iran and Israel, the Arab states were involved in sort of helping the Israeli air defense effort. Right? That didn't happen in this case. Right? The Arab states very clearly were not proactively involved. And there's a reason why those B-2 bombers had to fly all the way from the US mainland in two different directions, because one was, for the lack of a better term, a decoy, so to speak, right? So at one level, that has not happened. The Arabs have sort of hedged a little. But on the other hand, the credibility of that Iranian threat is now in question, at least against US assets in the region. So what are the options that Iran can consider? First is to bring you back to the point about how Iran frames this, right? If it can frame its continued bombardment of Israel itself with its missiles as a success, that's enough. Second is the question of its nuclear capabilities, right? If it sort of is able to convince again its own people, and there's a reason why I constantly use its people as a standard of reference. I'll get to that. That its nuclear facilities are still intact, then that also helps Iran in terms of both how it presents its deterrence options as well as its public and domestic messaging, right? But third, the substantial part of it all, right? Who and how will Iran finally attack? There is one precedent for this in the past, which is in January 2020, when the United States assassinated General Qasem Soleimani. That was on Iraqi soil. Then, too, the Iranians had promised retaliation. And because every time Iran promises retaliation, it means that the attack is, in effect, telegraphed to the United States and to the other allies that an Iranian attack is coming, keep your guard up. Now, whether this be true or not, whether this be true in cause or not, in effect, it helps them potentially repel the Iranian attack, or at least limit the damage that it causes. And this is exactly what happened in Iraq in January 2020, where the IRGC directly fired missiles at the Ain al Assad airbase in Iraq, but there were no US fatalities, and Donald Trump stood down. And that point in time, Trump was not facing any electoral pressures whatsoever because this was early 2020, right? There is a chance that the Iranians might attempt to repeat that now, but the crucial question here is how are its proxies placed? And I'll go over this very, very quickly,
Yeah.
right? And please feel free to stop me at any
No,
time
no,
because
because
these are
that's
conversations.
where yeah, yeah, that was my next question to you. Is Iran
Right.
going to be using
Yeah,
the
because the main strategic logic that Iran has followed in the region in the last 25 years is that it knows it cannot match the conventional and nuclear capabilities of Israel and its Western allies, right? So its sort of balance of power has been presented in an unconventional manner, where it cultivates a number of proxies in the region. And again, this is very, very simplistic, but just for the sake of conversation, who can sort of act as this threatened being for all of these states until Iran sort of manages its options, right? Hezbollah in particular has been cultivated to be a buffer against Israeli attacks on the Iranian mainland. But that has happened, right? That apocalyptic scenario of Israeli direct attacks on the Iranian mainland has happened. And yet Hezbollah has not been pressed into action. In fact, if you look at the last speech by Hezbollah Secretary General just about 3 days ago, when the Israeli strikes were happening, he makes no commitment whatsoever. He expresses a lot of solidarity with the Iranians, of course, but there is no commitment to action. Even after the US strikes so far, Hezbollah has indicated that it's sort of staying out of the war. Now, this is a reason that people have very easily missed because there's so much of noise that even in the years before the 7th October terror attacks in Israel by Hamas, which sort of dragged everybody else into this war because their older ideological commitments were tested, for Hezbollah, since 2019 and since 2022 in Lebanon, there were severe domestic pressures to the extent that Hezbollah had to focus on consolidating its internal position. When Hamas carried out its terror attack on Israel on October 7th, that calculus for Hezbollah did not change by any means, which is why you will remember that across 2024, or at least in the top half, then Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah continued to sort of stay ambiguous. Hezbollah and Israel's missile and rocket exchanges stayed calibrated. I think, again, this was evident to everybody. When that war was finally fought, it was on Israel's terms. And then when a ceasefire was secured, Hezbollah also has continued to sort of adhere to it, despite Israel continuing to strike key bases and key arms depots of the Hezbollah's armed cadre, right? And that logic continues even now, right? If anything, that logic has only strengthened further because Hezbollah's military capabilities, as certainly its top organizational leadership, has been decimated, right? So this feels counterintuitive, but under the spectacle, in terms of soul substance, what Iran is still facing is standoff strikes, right? It isn't facing a very large scale imminent military threat to the regime, meaning that it could collapse tomorrow. That is not happening, right? So that's first. Second is the Houthis. Unlike Hezbollah, the Houthis have proven to be far more resilient. Because again, our memories are short, including mine. It took some time for me to remind myself that even before the Israeli and US bombardment campaign on Yemen against the Houthis survived a 10-year long campaign by the Arabs, right? And the tonnage of bombs that have been dropped on them surpasses that of any other in the region, and that this region is no stranger to conflict, right? And yet the Houthis not only survive, in fact, survival is too low a benchmark, but they retain the potency to threaten global shipping, right? Now, because the United States carried out a very short but intense bombing run against the Houthis recently in April, uh, the United States ultimately, despite that bombing campaign, entered into a ceasefire with the Houthis, where the Houthis sort of agreed that we will no longer hit US interests. But Houthi attacks against Israel continued. Now, that tells you something about the US Israeli interest or that cohesion, so to speak, that sometimes we take for granted, because Israel was not happy with the ceasefire. But nonetheless, the Houthis continue to show that ability. Now, the Houthis have said that that ceasefire is off, right? Now, again, to note here that compared to all of the other proxies, the Houthis have a certain degree of autonomy that I would argue is higher than any of the other proxy groups, right? So the Houthis could very well restart that campaign, but they have also shown the ability that they can stop that campaign whenever, right? They're also very useful sort of bargaining tool for the Iranians. And the last one here is the Iraqi militias. Now, they are key because compared to all of the other theaters, given past precedent, anything could change. I repeat that. But Iraq still remains the most likely theater where Iran retaliation can focus, right? Regardless of what it does elsewhere. And that's why the Iraqis are currently very concerned. The Iraqi Prime Minister, for the last few months, has made a concerted effort to make sure that Iraq is not a proxy battleground. They have enough expressions of solidarity with the Iranians, but and I don't need to explain the Iraqis' relationship with the Americans either. But the point is that they want to be out of this conflict, and that is why the Iraqi government and its security forces have been able to strike this conciliation with the Iraqi militias that stand down and do not enter this war. And it has been in these militias' interests as well. And not to forget that these militias were very experienced and potent because they had a long experience of years fighting the Islamic State. And they are about 50,000 strong, ballpark figures, right? By April, a lot of these militias were also, in principle, agreeing to disarm because they also want to stay out of this. When Bashar al Assad also fell dramatically in December last year, these militias did not act. So, without going any more into the nitty-gritties of these things, the point is that all of these groups have their own interests. It is yet to be seen as to how Iran will press them into action. There is a chance that Iran might not press them into any concerted, organized action at all, right? There could be sporadic attacks coming from each of these, especially of the Houthis, but the Iranian retaliation perhaps most likely is to be directly from the IRGC, as happened in January 2020. But with these things, I think past precedent sometimes is also completely thrown off the table. So really, all bets are off. We don't really know what the Iranians will choose.
My next question would be about Khamenei right now, right? And of course, this whole chatter about US looking at not at a war to take down the nuclear sites in Iran, but also take down the regime. Uh, how much do you see it a war to take down the regime, and how much is it about just the nuclear sites that are there in Iran? What's your perception?
You know, I'm searching for lighter words than impossible. But the thing is here, both the objectives of complete dismantlement of the Iranian nuclear program and second, the objective of regime change, none of this is possible without either a sustained intelligence campaign inside Iran that makes use of existing organized dissident groups, including military factions, or a full scale ground invasion of the kind that we saw in Iraq. One single B 2 bombing run is going to cause neither of these, right? So the US goal of regime change has not been constant. In fact, in the past, that the US has said that they're not interested in this. Again, today, when Trump said that, why shouldn't there be regime change? He was again saying that in response to a question to a reporter. Every time a reporter asks Donald Trump a question, and it's a question that risks hurting his position or his agency, which he really loves to protect, then he makes a lot of these statements, right? But it's very clear that the Israelis have long had this objective. But in truth, if anything, my argument is that the regime in Iran was facing unprecedented domestic challenges already, right? And the
Right.
biggest challenge here is the economy. In the last decade, I think just ballpark figures, the devaluation of the Iranian rial has been close to 3,000%. And I'm sure if you check these numbers, they'll be, plus or minus in that same range. That it now trades to about, I think, 1 million to the US dollar. But simply the point is that the Iranian economy, especially for essential goods and medicine, inflation is close to 50%. The Iranian economy was struggling from the time of President Raisi, who was again tragically killed in a helicopter crash. If you look at how Khamenei's public statements were at the time that Raisi was still president, you had this unprecedented willingness on the part of several hardline Iranians to criticize his handling of the economy because they knew that they are reaching a very desperate point. When Pezeshkian was running for elections, he said something. He said that the Iranian economy situation today is worse than that during the Iran-Iraq war. I don't need to exaggerate. This is the Iranian president. And the Iran Iraq war was fought for 8 years. It was bloody. It was formative for a lot of the forces that the region sees today as influential. So when the Iranian president says this, it by no means is an understatement. I'm sorry, it's by no means is an exaggeration, right? So those economic pressures remain, right? So the regime was already threatened. You had these large scale protests that were triggered by Mahsa Amini's tragic killing by the Iranian regime. But that anger spilled over and became an anti-Khamenei protest, right? What happens now? Arguably, and this is again one of those old truths in history, and there are people with more gray hairs than my head who know this much better than I do. I'm still a very young researcher. The point is that no other variable is more useful in uniting a country than an external force. Now that the Israelis have sort of shown that they will go after Iranian urban centers, has caused this lightning blitz almost of cohesion across Iranian society. This does not mean that their anti regime sentiments have gone away. They will never go. The point is which one manifests more at any given point in time, right? So presently, the Iranian regime has all the space to tell their people that this is what we want you about. That those same American constituencies that so justifiably supported the women life and freedom movement in Iran are now completely quiet and refuse to condemn the Israeli bombardment of these same people. Right now, these are very, very valid arguments. But more importantly, because the attacks started while the Iranians were negotiating, the space for criticizing the regime and its tactical actions currently is very, very limited, right? If Iran was not in negotiations, if the Iranians had adopted a very, very hardline position, then I would argue the situation would be different. But even then, this cohesion that the Israeli attacks have created, it might not last. We don't really know. But the point is that the agency for change remains within Iran, no matter what the Israelis do, no matter what the Americans do. Just today morning, you had images and videos of President Pezeshkian in Tehran in the middle of a large demonstration among the people, right? Nobody knows propaganda better than the Iranian regime in that region, I would argue. Right? If anything, the Israeli strikes and the American bombardment has only given them the material to ensure their sustenance for a long time. Khamenei's succession was a question that was already being talked about in very hush-hush tones, right? Now, because the Israeli attack has allowed everybody to discuss it openly, which means it also gives this space to a lot of the constituencies within the IRGC, which is a very powerful faction, and the leader's office and the assembly of experts, which will ultimately decide the question of succession, to talk about this more openly, right? And one argument that I sort of also make is that the Iranians have seen the change in the supreme leader's office only once, right? And that is when Khomeini handed over to Khamenei. Since then, this current generation of Iranians have not seen a change in the supreme leader, and it was meant to be messy. But now they've gotten another moment in time, just like how the Iran-Iraq war provided them that moment earlier in history. They've now gotten another moment in time to say, now we are again fighting for Iran's soul, right? And these moments of chaos, of war, of external threat allows for decisions that will have impacts across the next decades, right? So this again might seem counterintuitive, but the question of Khamenei's succession perhaps has now become easier for the regime to, talk about, discuss, and then ultimately come to a decision about, right? But all that having been said, I don't think that the credibility of the threat to Khamenei's life is as real as it was, say, about a week ago, because I think the Iranians have shown their ability to sort of organize their leadership. But given Israel's ability to take out key leaders in very unprecedented ways, I think, again, nothing can be ruled out. But I think that's where things stand.
Okay, we'll get to know that as things progresses.
Yeah.
Bashar, I am particularly curious about Pakistan at this point in time. A couple of
Yeah.
days back, we had reports about Iran claiming that Pakistan may nuke US, right? Or Israel it was. Then Pakistan nominates Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. And then we see today morning Pakistan condemning America for the strikes.
Yeah.
What is really happening with Pakistan? Where is it? Is it really a stooge of America that people are saying, or as we know, what do you think is happening? Where is Pakistan positioned at this point in time in this conflict?
That question is one that has been asked at several points in history, and the answer is largely tilted to one, which is yes. But again, that's rhetoric. If you just look at what has happened now in these last few days, I'll just start off where you started your question, which is the Iranian statement. Who made that Iranian statement? It was General Mohsen Rezai, who's not a nobody in the Iranian leadership. He has served as one of the longest serving chiefs of the Revolutionary Guard. He is somebody who comes from the revolutionary era, who has had a big role in shaping the character of the Revolutionary Guards. He was giving an interview to Iran state television, and he said in Farsi that the Pakistanis have said that if Israel carries out a nuclear attack on Iran, then Pakistan will retaliate with a nuclear attack on Israel. This, whether it's true or not, is up in the air. The jury is still out, and I don't think anybody can tell what is true if there has been any such communication. What is more important is Pakistan's categorical denial the next day in parliament. The Pakistani foreign minister made sure to say that Pakistan has made no such claim, but he went one step ahead and said that the video is fabricated, right? I think he was only talking about the English dub on the Farsi video, but the Farsi video is very much authentic, right? But as I was suggesting earlier, that no one can speak to the accuracy of either the Iranian or the Pakistani claim. But what is very clear here is that the Pakistanis realized that they have an opportunity here that they did not anticipate. And this opportunity also this opportunity showed itself when Asim Munir went to Washington. If you remember, Asim Munir was already there on the 12th, right? Because he was supposed to be there for the US Army Day parade, to meet other US defense officials and a lot of those things. The Israeli attack happened on the 13th when the US president cut his G7 speech short, right? I think that injected new and unanticipated agendas for the Pakistan-US meeting, and I suspect that gave greater impetus for the president to meet Asim Munir directly in a closed door and discuss Iran. But the Pakistanis are by no means in an ideal position to do anything here, right? And the fact that we all know that it is in Pakistan's interest to amplify the US claim of having mediated between India and Pakistan during the May 7th to 10th crisis, right? To pander to Trump personally, because Pakistan cannot match India's ability to strike those grand strategic deals across sectors with the United States that India can. So, what Pakistan has chosen is to pander to the personal interests of the US president. And as we all saw, very happily tapped into his desire for a Nobel Prize and went ahead and said that we are nominating him for the prize, right? But the
Right.
very next day, the Pakistanis sort of condemned the US action a day after that nomination. I think that alone doesn't need any explanation or analysis as to how tactical and street smart in their sense they are being, as to how they can adapt to what's happening. But in a larger scheme of things, the Pakistanis have had enough issues with the Iranians. A lot of these issues being enduring. These are structural problems, not least at the border between Pakistan and Iran, where Baloch groups on both sides have caused them to not just carry airstrikes against each other, as we saw in January 2024, but cross-border raids, especially the Revolutionary Guards themselves in the last 10 years, multiple, right? And in Afghanistan, where the Taliban is not an ideal partner at this point, seemingly for both Iran and Pakistan. But structurally, what has been true is that the Iranians have always seen as the Taliban being hand in glove with those in Islamabad and Rawalpindi. And that has been an enduring bone of contention between these two states. And as I always sort of say, even in my other conversations, that natural sources of cooperation don't drop from the sky, right? Uh, with Pakistan, Iran, that is true, but it is also true between Pakistan and the United States. Right? And US experts have sort of shown this categorically that once you have a shift in US policy from this Afghanistan centric war on terror to a China centric Indo Pacific strategy, that one natural pillar which served as a source of cooperation between Islamabad and Washington, that's gone away. And that's arguably not coming back in any foreseeable immediate future, right? So, in the absence of that, the Pakistanis have to be creative. And I think that's what they're being. They're being creative. The limits of that creativity are for everybody to see. It can yield benefits at any given point in time. Depends also on the considerations of the US president and what the Pakistanis are offering him and what they're asking for in terms of trade. Because Donald Trump has made this statement 10 to 11 times now, right? That he has offered trade to both countries and is excited to trade with both countries. So again, that's up in the air, but I think that's where the Pakistani calculus is currently.
All right, Bashir. Thank you so much for your inputs on this whole conflict and also making sure that our viewers know what exactly is happening, why it's happening, and probably in our next conversation, we will delve into more details. We'll see how things go from here on. And thank you, viewers, for joining us. Bashir will come back again for another set of conversation. But in case you like this conversation, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, The Indian Express. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Bashir. Thank you.